Now I give the floor to the delegation of Kuwait. Mr. President, the delegation of Kuwait associates itself with the statement by the OIC and supports the efforts by the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar and the report presented before the Human Rights Council. We express our concern regarding the increase of IDPs in Myanmar as a result of the ongoing crisis, especially the forced displacement of the Rohingya Muslims and other minorities. And as a result, we call upon giving support by the international community and to take a firm stand to help the forcefully displaced by the Rohingya Muslims and their host communities and to secure their safe and voluntary report. We would like to stress that the Kuwaiti Fund for Arab Economic Development, in cooperation with the Kuwaiti Red Crescent Association and the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies for the Middle East and North Africa, has presented 1.3 million US dollars to implement the project of rebuilding Myanmar and to provide help for the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. Kuwait supports what was mentioned in the report of the IIMM on Myanmar on the importance of full and meaningful cooperation by the international community, especially the member states from Asia and the Pacific, to support the criminal procedures that would achieve justice in Myanmar.
Thank you, Mr. President. Canada thanks the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for its continued work to hold perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses to account in an increasingly challenging context. We are alarmed by the significant escalation of the conflict and the mechanism's report of, and I quote, more frequent and brutal crimes committed across Myanmar. We condemn all violations of international law and note that the mechanism has collected substantial and credible evidence of indiscriminate or intentional attacks against civilians, the burning of civilian infrastructure, and widespread conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence committed by the Myanmar military. Canada will continue to support the mechanism's activities. We reiterate our resolve to pursue accountability for serious violations of human rights and international law, including through our joint intervention in the case brought by the Gambia against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention. We reiterate our call for the military regime and all parties concerned in Myanmar to de-escalate violence, respect international and human rights law, and protect civilians. In this context, we also highlight the importance of all countries to provide access to safety for victims fleeing the conflict. Mr. Kumjian, how can member states help reduce impediments and improve the mechanism's access to Myanmar and other places where witnesses are located? Thank you.
I'm so sorry. The floor now is for Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the statement held by the European Union. Germany welcomes the head of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar and thanks Mr. Kumjian for his report. The mechanism was originally created to investigate the horrifying crimes committed against the Rohingya during the military's 2016 and 2017 expulsions. And yet, since then, the number of crimes and atrocities has constantly increased beyond the Rohingya against many other groups and individuals, starting after the military takeover in 2021 and leading up to the current escalation of armed conflict between the military and ethnic armed groups. We thank the mechanism for its important work in ensuring that one day all perpetrators can be held accountable. Furthermore, we, the international community, must come together to help Myanmar return to peace and put an end to such crimes. Mr. Kumjian, what can the international community do to respond to the further escalation in Myanmar?
Thank you. Now, give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We noted the mechanism report on the progress of its works in the last 1 year. We are deeply alarmed by the rampant acts of sexual violence and indiscriminate attacks against civilian and civilian objects. Protecting all civilian and victims must always be utmost priority and upheld by all parties. We reaffirm the critical work of the mechanism to ensure justice for Myanmar people, supporting ever toward lasting peace, rule of law, and democracy in the country. We further encourage the mechanism to foster closer collaboration with the wider civil society stakeholder in Myanmar. Their important contribution is needed not only to support the mechanism in implementing its mandate, but also to ensure the safe delivery of humanitarian aid to all people in Myanmar without discrimination. On the regional front, ASEAN remain committed to the five-point consensus as the main reference to address political crisis in Myanmar. We call on all parties concerned in Myanmar to exercise self-restraint, avoid further hostilities, and take concrete action for reconciliation. Commencing an inclusive national dialogue is indispensable for building mutual trust among Myanmar stakeholders and cementing concrete paths toward peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. La parole est au Luxembourg.
I give the floor to Luxembourg. Ambassador. Thank you very much, President. Luxembourg aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. We thank Mr. Kumjan and his entire team for their vital and meticulous work, which has enabled them to gather a record amount of evidence regarding human rights violations. We also hail the additional awareness-raising work done over the past 12 months to explain the complex, sensitive mission of the inquiry mission. We pay tribute to the fortitude and courage of witnesses cooperating with the mechanism. They risk their own lives to ensure that justice is finally meted out for the victims of the criminal atrocities perpetrated in Myanmar since 2016, primarily by the armed forces of the junta. Documentation is a prerequisite to determine the responsibility of perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity that the junta continues to perpetrate in full impunity. In this context, we hail the 3 cases underway at the ICJ, the ICC, and the Argentinian Federal Criminal Court. Luxembourg reiterates its call to the de facto authorities in Myanmar to immediately cease their violence against the civilian population and to release all political prisoners. We urge all other countries, in particular members of ASEAN, to collaborate with the mechanism in order to facilitate its task and to protect victims and witnesses. Mr. Kumjan, are there countries, organizations, or private companies that structured cooperation with could help advance the work of the IIMM? Thank you.
La parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to Malta, and I announce that the list of speakers is now closed. Malta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and thanks the independent investigative mechanism for its report and for its work. We remain deeply concerned by the persistent use of force by the military junta, leading to widespread atrocities, including extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, arbitrary detentions, and forced displacements. In this regard, we urge the Myanmar military and all armed groups to cease fighting, protect civilians, comply with international law, and to immediately allow full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. The evidence collected by the IIM is crucial for ensuring accountability. We call on Myanmar to fully cooperate with the IIM, allow unhindered access to investigate allegations, and hold perpetrators accountable. We urge Myanmar's military to immediately halt its campaign of violence and engage in meaningful dialogue with all stakeholders to restore democracy and respect for human rights, including the release of those unjustly detained, including foreign nationals. Malta calls for the international community to remain united in its efforts to protect the rights of the people of Myanmar and ensure justice for the victims. This includes maintaining support for the ASEAN Special Envoy to Myanmar and the full and urgent implementation of the 5-point consensus. I thank you.
Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. La parole est...
My thanks, Ambassador. I now give the floor to Switzerland. President, Switzerland thanks the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar for the presentation of its report as well as the documentation on violations and abuse. The evidence gathered regarding cases of violent repression of demonstrations, torture and abuse in detention, unlawful imprisonment of alleged opponents of the military authorities, attacks against civilians and their property, arbitrary murders and executions of civilians and combatants held during operations, and arson attacks on civilian infrastructure are devastating and must cease immediately. Switzerland would highlight the gravity of the situation in Rakhine and the violations recently committed against the civilian population, in particular since May 2024, as well as those caused by attacks that occurred on the 5th of August at the border with Bangladesh, which allegedly left dozens dead and displaced thousands of people. These developments demonstrate the need to ensure unhindered humanitarian access to those in need. Given the alarming finding of intensification of acts which may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, Switzerland highlights the relevance of the mandate and the IIMM's inquiries. Mr. Kumjan, given the recent deterioration in the situation, what needs have you identified to permit the mechanism to have additional support to help these investigations move forward? I thank you.
Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Thank you, sir.
I now give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU and thanks the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for its report. Ireland commends the mechanism's ongoing work in collecting, preserving and analysing evidence of international crimes and human rights violations and abuses, particularly when facing challenges including lack of physical access to crime sites or witnesses in Myanmar. We reiterate our strong support for the mechanism as a key way to challenge the culture of impunity for military leaders. We urge all member states to support the mechanism's crucial work. The latest report makes clear that the conflict in Myanmar has escalated and abuse perpetrated mainly by the Myanmar military. We are appalled by evidence that the number, complexity and geographic scope of serious crimes has continued to expand. We reiterate our call on the Myanmar military to cease all violence and attacks against the people of Myanmar immediately. We welcome the mechanism's focus on sexual and gender-based crimes and crimes against children, which are too often underreported and undocumented. We also welcome the mechanism's new avenue of investigation into crimes committed by multiple parties to the conflict against Rohingya in northern Rakhine State since May 2024. Mr. Kumjian, how can member states support the investigative mechanism in addressing the challenges you face, particularly in terms of access to witnesses? Thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Japan, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Mr. Kumjian for your briefing. Japan expresses serious concern about the continuing deterioration of the human rights situation in Myanmar. We deplore the human rights violation and atrocities committed by the Myanmar military against civilians, including arbitrary detention, forced conscription, and aerial attacks on schools, religious buildings, and hospitals. Japan once again strongly urges the Myanmar military to work toward a peaceful resolution to the situation by taking concrete action to 1. Immediately stop the violence, 2. Release those detained, and 3. Swiftly restore Myanmar's democratic political system and implement the ASEAN's 5-point consensus. At the same time, Japan earnestly hopes that all relevant stakeholders will make a maximum efforts to resolve the situation through the dialogue while respecting the will of the Myanmar people. Japan will continue to support such efforts. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Now the floor is for Malawi.
Malawi welcomes the report of the IIM, and we note with concern the extensive escalation of the conflict in Myanmar, with unwelcome reports of more frequent and brutal crimes committed across the country. We commend the mechanism for the significant progress across its various investigations, which has led to the collection of substantial evidence that a variety of war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed, and that this evidence may be used in the 3 ongoing investigations and judicial proceedings related to the crimes against the Rohingya. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you, sir. I now give the floor to you, Mrs. Ambassador of Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Australia welcomes the report by the IIMM. We commend your work in difficult circumstances to gather evidence and support accountability for international crimes. We share the desire for those responsible to face justice. The 6th report lays out clearly the responsibility of the Myanmar regime for appalling violence, forced displacement and hate speech against Rohingya communities. 7 years after so-called clearance operations, we recognise the victims and the courage of survivors. We are deeply concerned at the escalation of violence across Myanmar by the regime and other actors since the 2021 coup. We share the mechanism's concerns that crimes are becoming more frequent and brutal. The use of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence must end. We condemn the use of sexual violence as a weapon to maximise terror and fear. The regime must change course and cease violence. Australia welcomes all states cooperating with and supporting the mechanism and will continue to support accountability and justice for the victims. Mr. Kumijan, how can we encourage the full cooperation of member states with the mechanism's investigative activities? Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ambassador. Et maintenant,
Can I give the floor to the Ambassador of France? Thank you very much, President. France thanks Mr. Kumjan from the Mechanism for the Sixth Report, which documents the ongoing deterioration of the human rights situation in Myanmar and recalls that the expulsion of the Rohingya people and their fate remains unacceptable. 3,200,000 people are currently displaced in the country due to the conflict, highlighting the intensification of armed conflict and the inter-ethnic tensions, in particular the Rakhine state. This report gathers credible evidence, characteristics of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed essentially by the armed force under the control of the junta. France notes with extreme concern the deteriorating situation and firmly condemns the atrocities committed in violation of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. France calls on the junta to immediately cease violence, the attacks and bombardments of the bombings of the population and civilian infrastructure. It calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all people who are arbitrarily detained, for the respect of international humanitarian law, the protection of the civilian population and humanitarian workers, as well as full and unhindered access of the emergency aid. We call on all parties to the conflict to cooperate with the inquiry mechanism and to ensure it unhindered access to the ground and to victims in the framework of dialogue with civil society. Mr. Head of the Mechanism, France stands available to you and looks forward to your interest for the continuance of your mandate. I thank you. Thank you, sir.
مصر.
السيد الرئيس تأخذ مصر علما.
Thank you, President. Egypt has taken note of the report of the IIM regarding the gathering of evidence as to war crimes. We resoundingly condemn all violations committed against the Rohingya, and we regret the disastrous situation in which they are living. We call on the government of Myanmar to cease these violations, to take measures to protect the Rohingya and to address the crisis. We call on regional and international efforts to ensuring accountability. We call on OHHR to provide cooperation, bearing in mind the key role of cooperation with OIC as well, and Egypt welcomes the cooperation of Bangladesh in this matter as well. Thank you.
أسئلة أو ملاحظات إلى حد الساعة وتفضلوا.
I give the floor to Mr. Kumjan to respond to the questions.
Thank you very much. There were several questions about how the members present can support the mechanism. And probably the most key for us is to have direct contact with witnesses, which requires that these witnesses are protected, that they are in a position where they can safely speak to us and where we can assure that their safety and security is such that they will be available for judicial proceedings. To do that, we need to protect the cooperation of states. The mechanism is not a police force. We have no right to give anyone any right to live in any country or to travel anywhere. For that, we depend upon the cooperation of the states. And I think it's extremely important that we are able to protect witnesses and that states will come forward and be willing to accept on their territory some particularly vulnerable witnesses so that the mechanism can preserve their testimony. We also need the permission of states to operate on their territory. Again, we're not a police force. We need your permission before we can go on territory to take a statement. And we depend upon the cooperation of states, particularly states in the region where many of the witnesses are located. A couple of states, including Indonesia and Japan, mentioned the 5-point consensus. And I think all of the members of the Council support the 5-point consensus of ASEAN, in particular the very first point, which is end the violence. Well, what the mechanism is doing is collecting evidence of the very worst violence, whether it's committed by the military or if it's committed by another group. We don't care about the ethnicity, religion, or politics of the perpetrators or the victims. We're collecting the evidence. And if we want to discourage violence from happening in Myanmar, we want to try to put an end to this and an end to the impunity, then support our efforts. Allow us to operate on your territory. Help us to protect witnesses. It's not only Myanmar that's suffering from this. States in the region are bearing the burden of refugee flows into their country and all the other effects of the overspill, of the complete degradation of the Myanmar economy, the Myanmar educational system, the health system. It's affecting other states in the region. So help us to help you. Help us to collect the evidence to try to end this impunity. And it really also goes beyond the region. I've worked in many different conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, Charles Taylor, Cambodia. And one of the things we've seen when it comes to international justice, it's still in the process of developing. It certainly is not as universal as we would like it to be. But each time we have a success, it has effects beyond the borders of that country to others. Perpetrators around the world will know that that there is a possibility that the international community will hold people to account. So we want to make this example of Myanmar and this mechanism created by this council effective, actually having an effect to end the impunity, to see that people are punished for the crimes that they committed. And we can do that with your assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Komjian. We now then come back to our list of speakers, and I give the floor for such purpose to you, Mr. Ambassador of Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. Like the EU, Belgium welcomes the work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, which is vital to approach victims of justice. The report confirms that the violations, crimes, and suffering undergone by the population have been intensified. Sexual and gender-based crimes, serious violations of child rights continue to be perpetrated in full impunity, which we resoundingly condemn. Today, this being the 5th International Day for the Protection of Education from Attacks, it is alarming to see that Myanmar figures among the countries that are most affected across the world by attacks against schools, the majority of them involving explosive weapons. According to the last annual report of the Secretary General, 117 schools were attacked in 2023 and 82 were used by various armed actors. We call on all parties to the conflict to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and to protect the population, in particular children. We also urge all states in the region to actively support the mechanism and to collaborate with it to improve the gathering of data and evidence and to ensure the security of witnesses. Mr. Komjian, given the current circumstances, how can we expedite the process of accountability in order to break with this interminable cycle of violence? I thank you.
Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Thank you, sir.
I give you the floor, Mrs. Ambassador of United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for your report, Mr. Komjian. The situation in Myanmar remains tragic. We cannot allow ourselves to become complacent. We remain grateful for the work of the IIMM and commend you on the information and evidence collected and documented in the report, which covers a period of escalation in the conflict in Myanmar. We are deeply concerned about the incidents documented by the IIMM, which could amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. We denounce aerial attacks on non-military targets such as schools, religious buildings, and hospitals, as well as the torture and sexual violence that the IIMM found have been committed during the armed conflict. We are alarmed that in addition to the human rights violations by the military, the IIMM also found evidence of crimes committed by armed groups fighting against the military. The continuing atrocities underscore the IIMM's important role to promote accountability and justice and to foster deterrence. We understand that the IIMM has shared its previous findings with the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Mr. Kumjan, what actions can regional actors, particularly Myanmar's neighbors, take to support those affected by the atrocities that the IIMM documented? I thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ambassador. The floor is for United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. The mechanism's latest report provides further shocking evidence of gross human rights violations perpetrated by the Myanmar military. Civilians are being subjected to brutal extrajudicial killings, arson attacks on their homes, gender-based and sexual violence, and sharp increases in forced recruitment, including of children. We believe that the international community must act to break the cycle of impunity and demonstrate to the Myanmar military that they will be held accountable for violations of international law. The IIM's meticulous evidence gathering and recent reports on hate speech and sexual and gender-based crimes are crucial to that effort. The UK is proud to have provided £800,000 to support the mechanism's work. We also welcome the ICJ's consideration of the Gambia's case against Myanmar and have submitted a joint intervention in that case. We urge Myanmar to comply with the court's provisional measures. While we promote accountability, we must also seek to de-escalate tensions and protect innocent lives. We call on all actors, especially the Myanmar military, to prioritise the protection of civilians. Mr. Kumjan, how can the international community do more to support the IIM's vital work?
I thank you, Mrs. Ambassador. I now give the floor to Albania. Mrs. Ambassador, you have the floor. Microphone, please. Microphone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Albania welcomes the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. We are deeply concerned about the deteriorating situation across Myanmar, particularly in Rakhine State, where indiscriminated target at killing of civilians through airstrike, large-scale burning of homes, violent suppression of protests, torture, unlawful imprisonment, and attacks on civilians continues to be a widespread phenomenon. We appreciate the contribution of mechanism in gathering substantial evidence of crimes committed, which is essential for the benefit of justice and ensuring that those responsible for these heinous crimes are held accountable. Accountability is the only way to end the culture of impunity in Myanmar, and it is vital that perpetrators of human rights violations, including sexual and gender-based violence, are brought to justice. Albania will continue to fully support the work of the mechanism aimed at ensuring the accountability of perpetrators and justice for victims of the most serious international crimes and violation of international law committed in Myanmar since 2011. I thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ambassador. The floor now is for Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bulgaria aligns with the EU statement. Bulgaria deplores that the number of serious international crimes in Myanmar has continued to increase in frequency and scale, and expressed deep concern over the continuous use of violence against the civilian population, cases of torture and other abuses, including sexual and gender-based crimes and unlawful imprisonment of perceived opponents of the military regime. Bulgaria underlines the importance and expresses its support for the work of the IIMM in view of ensuring accountability for the most serious crimes. Finally, we reiterate our unwavering support for the Asian five-point consensus and for implementing the measures prescribed by the UN Security Council, the ICJ, and the ICC to address the deteriorating human rights situation in the country. Mr. Kumjan, in what way could digital technologies be further used to facilitate information gathering and analysis of the human rights abuses in Myanmar? And how can states facilitate their full use by the IIMM? Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكركم وأعطي الكلمة الآن للعربية السعودية. فتتفضل.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, President. We have taken good note of the report presented by the investigative mechanism for Myanmar. We are closely monitoring the situation in Myanmar, and we call on all stakeholders to engage in a constructive dialogue so as to achieve a practicable solution. My country reiterates its firm commitment to protecting civilians in Myanmar, in particular the Muslim Rohingyas. We call for them to be protected and for their fundamental rights to be guaranteed without further ado. This includes their right to citizenship and their right to a dignified return for all Rohingya refugees. Since the start of the crisis, my country has worked hard to help more than 506,000 Rohingyas. We have offered work opportunities to them and assisted their children. We have also helped Rohingya refugees in several countries by providing accommodation and healthcare to them. President, we will continue our support to the Rohingya with the cooperation of the international community so as to ensure that they can enjoy a free and dignified life. I give the floor to Belarus. President, we note the politicized nature of the HRC mandate on Myanmar, which does not have consensus and is carried out without the consent of the country concerned. This does not foster progress towards a constructive format of cooperation on human rights in Myanmar. We are concerned by how the information on the situation in Myanmar is prepared and verified. This leads to distorted perceptions and lopsided interpretations which are used for political purposes to discredit the authorities. The mechanism's work, even though it has not delivered much, consumes significant financial resources, which once again raises a question about how effectively these are used. We are convinced that we need to continue efforts to achieve a settlement of the conflict in close cooperation with the Myanmar authorities and to stabilize the situation. We hope that the country's authorities will achieve lasting settlements, but this can be helped by the efforts undertaken by neighboring states in the region.
I now give the floor to Bangladesh. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Bangladesh welcomes the report of the IIMM. We commend the mechanism's continued work to collect and preserve evidence of crimes committed in Myanmar, including those against the Rohingya. We appreciate the mechanism's engagement with the ICJ, ICC, and the court in Argentina. We are pleased to host the mechanism's successive missions to Bangladesh and remain committed to cooperate with it. The mechanism's access to Myanmar is critical for investigation. We urge Myanmar to cooperate with the mechanism. Ensuring justice and accountability is important for the Rohingya sheltered in Bangladesh to have the confidence to return to Myanmar. International community should therefore focus on accountability and creation of a congenial atmosphere in the Rakhine. Mr. President, Bangladesh is deeply concerned at the rapidly deteriorating situation in Rakhine. Over 20,000 Rohingyas have entered Bangladesh in recent weeks, which puts additional burdens on us. Armed conflict in Rakhine is also affecting the safety and security of the people and property of Bangladesh along the border. We urge all warring parties to end the conflict immediately and stop all human rights violations against Rohingyas. We also urge the international community to take immediate action to protect the Rohingyas in Rakhine, as well as provide humanitarian assistance to them. I thank you, Mr. President. I thank you, sir. The floor now is for Lao PDR.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation has closely followed the situation in Myanmar. We call on all relevant parties to refrain from escalation of the conflict, ensure the protection and safety of all civilians, and to create conducive environment for humanitarian assistance and inclusive national dialogue. The Laupedia firmly supports the ASEAN central role in helping Myanmar to find inclusive and durable peaceful solution to the conflict based on Myanmar-owned and Myanmar-led principles. We reaffirm that the ASEAN leaders' 5-point consensus remain the main reference to address the political conflict in Myanmar and commend the efforts made by the Special Envoy of ASEAN Chair on Myanmar to facilitate its implementation in its entirety. We reiterate that the work of HRC and its mechanism should be guided by the principle of universality, impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, constructive dialogue, and cooperation. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The floor now is for Malaysia.
Mr. President, Malaysia aligns itself with the statement of the OIC, and we thank Mr. Komjan for his report. We remain deeply concerned by the continued escalation of violence in Myanmar. We strongly urge all parties to immediately cease hostilities, take steps to create a safe and conducive environment for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and implement measures to ensure the protection of all civilians. We commend and support the mechanism for its relentless efforts in collecting and preserving evidence of crimes committed in Myanmar, particularly against the Rohingya, and for preparing materials for current and future criminal proceedings to pursue accountability. We reiterate that the mechanism should be provided with adequate resources and support to continue its critical work. Mr. President, we thank the international community for supporting ASEAN in finding a peaceful and lasting resolution to the crisis in Myanmar through the ASEAN 5-point consensus. Here, we urge the Myanmar military not to ignore its responsibilities and to fully implement the commitments outlined in the ASEAN 5-point consensus without further delay. Finally, while we hope for an inclusive and durable solution to this crisis that will allow for a safe, voluntary, and dignified return of Rohingya refugees, we call on the international community, particularly the signatories of the 1951 Refugee Convention, to step up efforts in providing equitable resettlement pathways for Rohingya refugees to third countries. Thank you.
I thank you, madam. I now give the floor to Venezuela.
Thank you, President. Venezuela recognizes the complexity of the situation in Myanmar. We encourage further good faith efforts in a quest for lasting peace and sustainable development for the people of Myanmar, with a non-politicized focus and in strict compliance with international human rights law, and for respect for sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs. In this vein, we consider that the implementation of unilateral coercive measures and the imposition of mandates do not contribute in any way to addressing the needs of the Myanmar people. Quite the contrary, such actions can generate greater internal tensions. Venezuela will continue advocating for the human rights of the people of Myanmar, and we encourage efforts for peace and lasting security in Myanmar. And we call for a political settlement as a key way for addressing the many issues in the country. Thank you.
The floor is for
Thank you, Mr. President. We have taken note of the report of the IIMM. History and reality have repeatedly proven that only by upholding the basic principles of international relations, such as sovereign equality and non-interference in internal affairs, can we truly resolve problems and promote and protect human rights. Relevant discussions at the Council should contribute to political and social stability, as well as peace and reconciliation in Myanmar, and avoid exacerbating conflicts. China always adheres to the principle of non-interference and supports Myanmar in maintaining stability, developing economy, and protecting people's livelihood, and provides constructive assistance to all parties in Myanmar in resolving differences through political consultations within constitution and legal framework. We support ASEAN's due role in resolving the issue in Myanmar. We are willing to work with countries in ASEAN to promote a solution to the issue of Myanmar. We believe that early repatriation is the only way to resolve the Rohingya issue in Rakhine State. We support Myanmar and Bangladesh to move closer and to find a mutually acceptable solution through friendly consultations and in accordance with existing repatriation arrangements between the two countries. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Time is I now give the floor to Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. As the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar demonstrates, the situation on the ground has been deteriorating since the military coup in 2021. We remain particularly concerned by increased fighting and the worsening security situation since last October. The atrocities against civilians in the Rakhine State, particularly against the Rohingya Muslims, must come to an end, and the perpetrators must be brought to justice. Among those targeted, Rohingyas have long been recognized as one of the most persecuted groups in the world. It is the joint responsibility of the international community to find a lasting solution to the crisis. We call on all parties to the conflict to prioritize protection of civilians and prevent further incitement of violence, and to allow access to the region for the immediate and unhindered flow of humanitarian assistance. Creating the necessary conditions for the safe, voluntary and dignified return of the Rohingyas to their homeland is essential. The ICJ ruling on the admissibility of the Gambia's application is also a crucial step forward. Turkey will continue its relief efforts to the various fields, including health, housing, education, and income generating.
Thank you, Madam. And now the floor is for Gambia.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Gambia aligns itself with the statement of the OIC. We commend the IIMM for the outstanding work carried out since the beginning of its mandate. 7 years after the outbreak of widespread and horrific violence by the Myanmar security forces against the Rohingya in the Rakhine State, we remain troubled by the continuation of such atrocities and the evidence of systematic killings, torture, as well as sexual and gender-based violence against detainees and those opposed to military rule. We equally condemn reports of crimes committed by some armed groups fighting against the military. We welcome the mechanism's use of advanced technology to enable more efficient collection, preservation, and analysis of evidence, as well as its efforts to share such evidence with the various accountability mechanisms at the ICC, ICJ, and Argentina. Mr. President, despite the overwhelming evidence of atrocities, the Myanmar military continues to operate with impunity, as no efforts have been made to hold any perpetrator accountable. The ongoing reports of atrocities against the Rohingya also underscore a troubling disregard for the provisional measures issued by the ICJ. Therefore, we deplore the lack of cooperation from the Myanmar authorities towards the mechanism and call on them to take necessary steps to protect the civilian population. Thank you.
I thank you, sir. The Gambia was the last of speakers speaking on behalf of members of the Human Rights Council. We now move to the list of NGOs, and we will begin by giving the floor to International Commission of Jurists.
Mr. Kumjan, the ICJ welcomes the progress made by the IIMM in its investigations into crimes such as evidence collected on torture and other abuses in detention, including the commission of sexual and gender-based crimes. The ICJ encourages the mechanism to continue incorporating a gender perspective in their work and ensure gender-competent justice for survivors. Steps that can be taken include making their gender-related policies and strategies public to strengthen the engagements of CSOs on gender issues with the mechanism. The IIMM can develop public versions of analytical modules on gender constructs in Myanmar and their impact on the commission of crimes and harms experienced by survivors. These should be developed, ensuring the participation of women and LGBTQI+ persons with diverse religious and ethnic backgrounds. The ICJ commends the IIMM for sharing evidence and analysis with the 3 ongoing investigations and judicial proceedings related to crimes against the Rohingya. The ICJ deplores the accountability gap concerning serious crimes under international law committed post-coup, which further entrenches cycles of impunity. We call on UN member states to hold perpetrators of serious crimes under international law accountable, including gender-based crimes and crimes committed post-coup against different ethnic groups, including by exercising universal jurisdictions. I thank you.
Thank you. The floor now is for ASEAN Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Mr. President, we welcome the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar and appreciate the progress in investigations, including investigations into crimes committed following the attempted coup in February 2021, despite the highly volatile situation in the country. We urge the mechanism to continue to prioritize a victim-centered approach, which emphasizes the protection and welfare of victims in its investigations, and to enhance outreach to victim and survivor groups, including leaders of the Rohingya community. 7 years after the targeted violence that may constitute genocide and crimes against humanity, forcing over 700,000 Rohingya to take refuge in Bangladesh, Rohingya in Myanmar are once again facing the prospects of recurrence of similar atrocities. The actions that may constitute crimes against humanity and war crimes by both the military and the Arakan army and the escalating conflict in Rakhine State pose an existential threat to Rohingya remaining in Rakhine State. This situation underlines the need for accountability for all actors implicated in crimes against Rohingya, including the military and the Arakan army. In this regard, we welcome the mechanism's commitment to investigate alleged crimes regardless of the affiliation or ethnicity of the perpetrators or victims. We urge member states to continue to provide support and cooperation for the mechanism to effectively carry out its mandate. And we call on member states to refer the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court under Article 14 of the Rome Statute. Thank you.
I thank you. Je donne maintenant la parole au centre.
I now give the floor to the Centre for Civil et Politique. This will be a video message.
President. The Center for Civil and Political Rights appreciates the work of the IIMM and welcomes its report. The fact that the Myanmar military and affiliated militias continue committing crimes against humanity and war crimes with total impunity, but also that such crimes are reportedly committed by other groups fighting against the military, shows how the rule of law and domestic justice system have completely collapsed in Myanmar since the coup. As stated in the report of the mechanism, no one has yet been held accountable for these crimes, while the number of serious international crimes in Myanmar continues increasing in frequency and scale. The role of international accountability mechanism is even more important to end the culture of impunity in the absence of functioning domestic judicial system to ensure accountability. Noting that the IIMM is sharing the evidence collected with the ICC, ICJ, and the Federal Prosecutor's Office number 9 in Argentina concerning crimes against Rohingyas, efforts of all stakeholders must continue and intensify to assist and enhance these processes. The lack of accountability is enabling the perpetrators to continue committing crimes. Mr. Kumjan, what else can be done to enhance the ongoing process at ICC, ICJ, and in Argentina? Who can play a role to realize accountability for the crimes committed since the coup? I thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Thank you, Mr. President. CSW thanks the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for its detailed report. We reiterate the importance of incorporating religious intersectionality in the identification and documentation of grave human rights violations against ethnic and religious minorities in Myanmar, particularly in conflict-affected regions. We welcome the mechanism's continued gathering of evidence of serious international crimes committed by the military in Myanmar. While we also welcome the efforts of current accountability mechanisms, including the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the legal processes in Argentina, these platforms are yet to adequately address crimes committed against broader ethnic and religious groups, both pre- and post-coup. We call on member states to ensure that those responsible for these crimes are brought to justice. According to the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners, Burma, 27,000 political prisoners have been arrested on vague and overbroad laws since the 2021 coup, and over 20,000 remain in detention. Among those who have since been released is the former president of the Kachin Baptist Convention, Reverend Dr. Sampson, who was held from December 2022 until July 2024 on unfounded charges of unlawful association, defaming the state, and terrorism. We call on the military to ensure that Reverend Sampson and his family are permitted to enjoy his freedom in peace and without fear of further prosecution. We also continue to call for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining political prisoners. Thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada.
Mr. President, Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada and the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute condemn the escalation of atrocity crimes by the Myanmar junta targeting conflict-affected groups. Over 20,800 people are arbitrarily detained without access to independent courts or adequate legal representation. Lawyers face threats, prosecution, or unlawful detention when representing political detainees. We support the progress and outreach by the mechanism in the collection and analysis of information related to the violent suppression of protests, torture, and other abuses in detention, and unlawful imprisonment of perceived opponents of the junta. We are alarmed at the rise in airstrikes and the use of landmines by the junta against minorities such as the Karenni, Karen, and others, leading to over 3 million internally displaced people and mass flows of forcibly displaced persons to neighboring countries without adequate refugee protection. The High Commissioner has noted that human rights defenders are particularly exposed to threats and refoulement. Internally displaced and refugees from minorities such as Karenni, Karen, Chin, Kachin, Shan, and Rohingya peoples need more international assistance. The international community and UN bodies must urgently halt all engagement with the junta and stop the flow of weapons. Engage with the national unity government, ethnic communities, and civil society to strengthen local governance systems. Ensure accountability for international human rights atrocities and provide international protection and humanitarian assistance for vulnerable groups. Thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in person.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for its report and commend its efforts to collect evidence pointing to the widespread human rights violations, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Since July 2023, brutal acts such as the violent suppression of protest, unlawful detention, torture, and sexual violence have escalated. The military continues to target civilians through indiscriminate air and ground attacks, affecting homes, schools, and places of worship. This has led to over 3 million people being displaced during the reporting period. Credible evidence of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as forced recruitment of children under 15 years of age into armed groups, highlights the enduring impact of these crimes on Myanmar's most vulnerable populations. Children bear the lifelong consequences of these atrocities, losing access to education, healthcare, and the safety of family life due to forced displacement. While the mechanism has provided critical evidence to ongoing investigations to the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, a lack of accountability persists. IFERD and the Geneva International Center for Justice urges the international community to take decisive action. We call for enhanced cooperation and for an active pursuit of justice for Myanmar's victims. Finally, we fully support the mechanism's independent collection of evidence, which is essential and must be conducted without interference to ensure true accountability for the crimes committed. Thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the Arab European Center of Human Rights and International Law by video.
سيد الرئيس إن تقييم الوضع الإنساني.
Thank you, President. The assessment of the humanitarian situation in Myanmar, according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, is one of a disastrous situation with around 45,000 people among the Rohingya Muslims who having taken refuge in a border region near Bangladesh. The army in recent years has targeted Rohingya Muslims by imposing restrictions which have a significant impact on their lives. Moreover, there are arbitrary detentions, torture, and the terror imposed by the army against the Rohingya Muslims. The army disregards all warnings from the United Nations and is not ceasing acts of violence. It is not protecting civilians. The European Arab Center for International Law and Human Rights calls for additional measures to be imposed against the Myanmar government so as to ensure that it abides by international conventions. Thank you.
On the list for this interactive dialogue, I then come back to you, Mr. Kumjian, for their concluding observations and remarks. Then you have the floor, sir.
Well, thank you all very much for the questions and for the expressions of support. Many of the questions dealt with how we can assist these accountability processes that are ongoing. The mechanism is very actively involved in trying to assist the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice proceedings, and the proceedings in Argentina by sharing evidence. And we continually are in dialogue with them about how we can be of assistance. What I can tell you is that all of these processes are very active, and I do believe that there's going to be results. How can you support? I think it's important that you do try to support these processes, including by, in the case of the International Criminal Court or Argentina, supporting the carrying out of arrest warrants outside of the, perhaps on your own territory. These courts cannot by themselves effect arrest warrants, and it's up to the states to cooperate with them in order to do that. I'd also say that the mechanism supports, very much appreciates all the support we receive, but we do have strains on our resources. As people pointed out, we're collecting millions of items of evidence. Most of it is in the Burmese language. So translation is a huge challenge for us. We're trying to work on technical solutions such as quality machine translation, and assistance on resources for that would be appreciated. We're halfway around the world from Myanmar. Witnesses are scattered now in different places, but most of them still in the area of Myanmar. So for us to gather forensically sound evidence, we need to engage directly with witnesses, which means to travel to them or to bring them to a place where we can speak safely. And that again requires resources. So we appreciate the support of all your states in getting us the resources necessary to fight this fight. And we will continue to collect evidence of the violence throughout the country. We recognize the crisis now in trying to gather evidence to determine who is responsible for crimes in Rakhine. But we're also looking around the country. We see massacres, bombings, aerial bombings affecting people around the country, sexual violence, both in detention and outside of detention, and we're trying to gather that evidence. We need your support, and we appreciate the political support you've given us. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Komjian, together with all the members of the investigative mechanism for Myanmar, for your participation and your contribution in this presenting your report, but also having this interactive dialogue with the memberships and other stakeholders. We thank you so much for that. Excellencies, dear participants, we will now take a short break again before beginning the interactive dialogue on the report of the Office of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka in about very few minutes, hopefully.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, we will now, as announced before, begin the interactive dialogue on the report of the Office of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka, as mandated in Council Resolution 51/1. As usual, the list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. It is then my honor to welcome back Mr. Volker Türk, High Commissioner for Human Rights, to present the report. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Sri Lanka stands at an important crossroads. The report of my office outlines concerning trends over the past 2 years and highlights renewed threats to fundamental freedoms, including regressive laws and the erosion of democratic checks and balances, as well as harassment and intimidation of civil society and journalists. It shines a spotlight on recurring patterns of past violations, including arbitrary detention and torture, and underlines real risks for the future in the absence of deeper reforms. Sri Lanka must break from the past and chart a new course. And the situation in Sri Lanka needs the continuing attention and support of this Council and the international community. 2 years have passed since mass protests demanded democratic reforms, an end to corruption and the abuse of power. Today, despite promises of a new beginning, those demands remain largely unfulfilled. And while 15 years have passed since the end of the devastating civil war, victims and their families are still waiting for truth, for justice, and for reparation. Instead, a prevailing sense of impunity impedes meaningful progress and encourages continued violations and more corruption. Meanwhile, for many people, the economic situation is precarious. The poverty rate doubled between 2021 and 2023, and more households are forced to choose between food or healthcare, between education or energy. Sri Lanka is also approaching presidential and parliamentary elections later this year, and the newly elected administration must commit to the concrete transformational changes needed to ensure accountability, justice, and reconciliation. Those in power must protect fully the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly prior, during, and after the upcoming elections. And the international community must support this transformation. It is important for Sri Lanka's creditors to provide the government with the fiscal space necessary to realize all human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights. Mr. President, I am especially concerned by new or proposed laws granting broad powers to security forces and expanding restrictions on citizens and civil society. One such example, the draft NGO registration and supervision bill, has a range of problematic provisions, including broad discretion given to authorities to deny registration of civil society organizations, which carry major risks threatening civic space. Reports of persistent harassment, surveillance, and intimidation of journalists, civil society actors, victims, and human rights defenders are unacceptable. Meanwhile, abuses by police and security forces are prevalent, and we continue to receive concerning allegations of arbitrary detention and torture. The absence of accountability for past and present violations is a fundamental problem, illustrated by the lack of meaningful progress in emblematic cases. Investigation and prosecution of the 2006 massacres of 17 humanitarian workers in Muttur, the killing of 5 Tamil students in Trincomalee in the same year, and the murder of journalist Lasantha Eknaligoda in 2009, to cite just some key instances, have faced prolonged delays and setbacks. Other cases have been interfered with, dropped, or been the subject of acquittal on deeply questionable grounds. There's also been limited progress in the criminal investigation into the 2019 Easter Sunday bombings. And today, people allegedly responsible for gross violations continue to be appointed to senior positions. Further, this entrenched impunity has manifested itself in the corruption, abuse of power, and governance failures that were among the root causes of the country's recent economic crisis. In Sri Lanka, the fate and whereabouts of tens of thousands of people who have been subjected to enforced disappearance over the decades are still unknown. Their families are stuck in purgatory, waiting for answers, and those responsible have not been held to account. This must change, and that would start with a formal acknowledgement of the serious violations that occurred during the war, of the responsibility of the state and security forces for the conduct of their own personnel, and of the legacy of those atrocities for victims and communities. A clear public change of narrative along these lines would help to re-establish trust in the authorities and begin to address the deep polarization in the country. And it finally would allow processes of truth and reconciliation and healing to make real advances, rebuilding the social contract. Excellencies, across the globe, the failure to deal with the demons of the past, to ensure accountabilities for international crimes, is renewing old conflicts, is creating new conflicts, and is sowing the seeds for future conflicts that will haunt people again and again. Without accountability, the legacy of violence is simply more violence. And impunity is a cancer that weakens states and societies. But there is another path, paved with justice and accountability, that leads to healing, reconciliation, and peace. I urge Sri Lanka to follow it. Going forward, Sri Lanka must pursue an inclusive national vision that addresses the root causes of the conflict, one that undertakes fundamental constitutional, legal, and institutional reforms to strengthen democracy and advance accountability and reconciliation. The government must implement important, significant security sector reform, including holding to account those individuals implicated in serious violations. And it must take immediate steps to prevent human rights violations. My office is not here to point the finger, but to lend a hand. We are reflecting what Sri Lankans from all communities are telling us. They want change, and my office is ready to support Sri Lanka on that journey. In the meantime, it is important for this Council and UN member states to continue to address the accountability gap in Sri Lanka, including by supporting the work of my office. The Council and individual states can help to create the conditions and political will for meaningful accountability and reconciliation. Towards that end, states can take action through their own domestic systems, as well as through international fora, including, for example, set out in the UN human rights treaties. Mr. President, people and communities across Sri Lanka have experienced upheaval and distress for far too long. It is high time to bring closure to the past, to break a destructive cycle that leads to more violence and creates more victims, and to begin an inclusive journey towards a just and sustainable future for all Sri Lankans. Thank you.
I thank you, Mr. High Commissioner, for presenting this report. And according to our practice, we will start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned. I then give the floor to Sri Lanka. Mrs. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, High Commissioner, as the Council deliberates on the High Commissioner's report on Sri Lanka, I wish to reiterate Sri Lanka's long-standing commitment to constructive engagement with this Council, the UNHRC, and the related treaties, as well as other human rights mechanisms to which we are party. Let me restate at the outset Sri Lanka's opposition to HRC Resolution 51/1, which mandated the report under consideration and the establishment of the external evidence gathering mechanism. This resolution was adopted without Sri Lanka's consent by a divided vote. We disassociate with the report for the reasons stated in our detailed response available on the OHCHR website. After facing its worst economic crisis, Sri Lanka succeeded in stabilizing its economy through a combination of prudent decision-making and enhanced financial oversight and governance, overcoming unprecedented social and political challenges. The resilience of Sri Lanka's democratic institutions and economic recovery has been widely recognized domestically and commended by international agencies, bilateral and multilateral partners. This fragile but solidly grounded economic stability and the completion of debt restructuring has led to improved economic indicators, including a positive economic growth of 5.3% in the first quarter of 2024, currency appreciation, a tripling of remittances, strengthened foreign exchange reserves, and a reduction in inflation from over 70% in September 2022 to 1.7% by June 2024. As an outcome of these economic measures, we are already delivering tangible benefits to Sri Lankans in their daily lives. Transitioning from a debt-driven economic crisis towards stabilization and inclusive growth involves budgetary restrictions, which cause unfortunate short-term adverse impacts on various segments of society, particularly the vulnerable. This is an unavoidable consequence of the financial crisis and the stringent measures required for economic recovery, a reality not unique to Sri Lanka. Strengthening the economy is vital to the enjoyment of economic and social rights as well as the right to development. Welfare measures such as Aswasumu Cash Transfer Program, the National School Nutrition Program, and the Urumaya Land Ownership Scheme mitigate the efforts of fiscal austerity on vulnerable groups. In parallel with economic recovery, the government continues to take steps to heal past wounds and to address the residual issues affecting civilians from all communities arising from decades of conflict. These include rehabilitating ex-combatants and child soldiers, demining, developing the North and the East, providing reparations, resettling the internally displaced, releasing private land to original owners, offering livelihood assistance, and continuing inquiries into missing persons. To promote national unity and reconciliation among our diverse communities, domestic initiatives such as the Office on Missing Persons, the Office for National Unity and Reconciliation, the Office for Overseas Sri Lankans, and the Interim Secretariat for the Truth and Reconciliation Mechanism have been established. Details of these initiatives are included in our response to the report. As one of Asia's oldest democracies, Sri Lanka has navigated its challenges while maintaining the stability of our democratic institutions and traditions. Our leaders have been held accountable through free and fair elections, and peaceful transitions of power have been consistently upheld. The upcoming presidential election on 21st September reaffirms our commitment to this process. The report steps far out of its mandated sphere of human rights to comment on macroeconomics as well as financial and budgetary issues under sovereign parliamentary purview. Contrary to the reaction of the rest of our international partners, it projects a negative overview for Sri Lanka's future, fails to recognize social stabilization and the preservation of parliamentary democracy overcoming severe challenges, the return to normalcy with the restoration of food, energy, and public services, and stability arising from a significantly improved outlook. Furthermore, it makes no mention of the brutal acts of terrorism and human rights violations committed by the LTTE, including child recruitment, suicide bombings, assassination of democratically elected MPs and leaders of Sri Lanka and abroad, and the disruption of democratic rights and freedoms of the people, especially in the North and the East. Mr. President, I wish to once again emphasize Sri Lanka's rejection of Resolution 51/1 and the external evidence gathering mechanism established within the OHCHR. This unwarranted mechanism exceeds the Council's mandate, contradicts its founding principles, and polarizes the Council, undermining the progress we have made domestically. This selective and disproportionate focus on hand-picked developing countries while ignoring critical situations elsewhere is unacceptable. We urge the Council to avoid politicization and double standards on dire humanitarian situations that require urgent action to maintain its credibility. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you. I now give the floor opening the list of speakers to Qatar on behalf of Cooperation Council for the Arab States of the Gulf. لكم الكلمة قطر.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. I am speaking on behalf of the GCC. We have taken good note of the High Commissioner's report on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. Mr. President, we are very closely monitoring the efforts undertaken by the government of Sri Lanka with a view to bringing about national reconciliation and to ensuring accountability. This given the serious economic crisis. Nonetheless, we welcome the cooperation of the government of Sri Lanka with the international human rights mechanisms, its commitment to its international obligations, particularly through the creation of an interministerial standing committee addressing human rights. We welcome the efforts made to assist the vulnerable families and to ensure food security. We encourage the government of Sri Lanka to pursue measures taken with a view to legislative reform to ensure the effectiveness of constructive dialogue, culminating in national reconciliation on the basis of human rights across the country. We also support international efforts seeking to assist Sri Lanka with technical assistance, capacity building, and national reconciliation, as well as economic prosperity well-being.
On behalf of a group of countries, while announcing that the list of speakers is closed.
Mr. President, I speak on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. We thank the High Commissioner for this update. We recognize the deep impact of the economic crisis on all in Sri Lanka. This report sets a call for action. We call on the government to take immediate and credible steps to strengthen accountability and reconciliation efforts, address all violations committed during and after the civil war, and put an end to impunity. The tens of thousands of unsolved cases of enforced disappearances should be addressed with urgency. Acts of commemoration need protection. Ahead of the presidential elections, we call on repealing or amending